Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. The topic of today's video is open source. In this video, we will understand the basic introduction to open source and some more important points about open source. So almost all the big tech companies and leading startups use open source. So the topics we will discuss in this video are what is open source, history of open source, advantages of open source, difference between closed source and open source, is open source bug free, some data about open source. Now, the question is, what is open source? So, the open source is a term that originally referred to open source software OSS. Open source is a philosophy that encourages community effort and collaboration on software by making the software source code available to public. Kubernetes and Linux are the examples. We will discuss more examples in this video. So, if you use open source software, you cannot only report a bug or request a feature, but you can also fix that bug or implement that feature. Open source code is usually stored in public repository and shared publicly. Anyone can access the repository to use the code independently or contribute improvements to the design and functionality of overall project. Open source software usually comes with a distribution license. This license include terms that define how developer can use, study, modify, and most importantly, distribute the software. So there are some more examples of open source software like Docker, Python, Firefox, GIMP, VLC Media Player, PHP, GCC, and Blender. So let's briefly discuss what is the history of open source. So the idea of making open source code freely available originated in 1983 by the OSI ideological movement founded by Richard Stallman, who was the programmer at MIT. So Richard believed that software should be accessible to programmers so they could modify it as they wish with the goal of understanding it, learning about it, and improving it. Richard Stallman began releasing free code under his own license called GNU Public License. This new approach and ideology surrounding software creation took hold and eventually led to the formation of Open Source Initiative OSI in 1998. The four most popular licenses of open source software are MIT license, GNU General Public License, Apache license, BSD license. Now let's discuss what are the advantages of open source. First of all, open source allow individuals and organizations to learn lot of new things. Higher quality software is the top benefit of open source software. By contributing to open source, you will grow as a developer and you will meet amazing people. Programmer can use pre-existing code to improve the software and can even come with their own innovations. And reliability. So the open source code is reliable because the open source code is constantly updated through active member of open source communities. Now let's discuss what is the difference between open source and closed source software. So the closed source software is developed in isolation with a small team of developers, but open source software is released and developed by development communities, and open source software offers developer support and large community to help. So there are some different examples of open source and closed source softwares. So the closed source software are like Photoshop, Microsoft Word, iOS, and the open source softwares are Linux, Ubuntu, Firefox, and etc. Now the question is open source bug free? So the short answer to this question is no. Open source code will contain code quality, performance, and security flaws. However, the broad base of code contribution can also mean that bugs are identified and fixed faster. So now let's discuss some data about open source. If we look at the survey results, 90% of IT leaders are using open source. 84% of Fortune 100 companies use GitHub. So in 2022, the adoption level of Kubernetes is increased by the organizations. Over the last 30 years, around 200 companies are founded with open source. 94% of hiring managers are making hiring open source talent a priority. Companies are rapidly adopting open source. Government use open source. 2 in 5 companies give higher rise to professionals with open source skills. container usage is an increasing factor of open source adoption. 9.58% of hiring managers are increasing open source training for their employees.